Thank you all for attending today. My name is Darko Vukovic, and today's topic is on how to make decisions by asking questions. As a product manager, you're going to be faced with many decisions that you need to make, and so it's important to make very well-informed decisions. PMs don't have to make all the decisions. There's a subset that falls within our domain, but you might also have to participate in making decisions that are really made by somebody else where you are a contributor. And so this framework should be able to help you with that as well. Making good decisions is really hard. Even if you have all the data and all the context, making a decision requires a lot of critical thinking, a lot of what-if scenarios, and so it's hard even in that situation. But in the real world, you're generally faced with incomplete data and also subjective data that's been interpreted by someone else potentially multiple times over. And so it's even harder in the real world to make great decisions. So when we make decisions, we have to account for the fact that these decisions could, have risk incorporated in the process, as well as we have to try our best to do as much upfront work to make sure these decisions are good. Questions, I believe, are one of the best ways to de-risk decision making. And so this talk today is going to be me walking you through a framework that I've been employing for my career so far. And I'm hoping that it's going to be helpful to you too as you go about doing your job. So first, let's start with some definitions. A decision, for the purpose of this talk today, is an agreement to take actions in the pursuit of goals. So an agreement amongst a group of people to take actions, something you do, some verb, in the pursuit of some goal. And the goal is going to be defined here in a second. Now, a question is a desire to understand one's interpretation of the truth. And what's important here is that when you're going to be asking questions, you should be genuinely looking for the actual interpretation that one has to offer you. Don't try to get them to say what you want, right? Look for the truth and try to pull out as much from a person as you can. And you might pose questions to yourself as well. And it's also important to understand that every answer is going to be somebody's interpretation of the truth. There is nobody who sees truth, for all that it is in its perfect form. Everybody's got their own interpretations that get layered into their responses. So it's important to understand that, while no answer is going to be a perfect representation of the truth, every answer should be taken with a degree of skepticism because it is only a representation and an interpretation of how somebody sees the world, and it's not fact. And that discrepancy is actually where risk is introduced, and we'll cover that in a little bit here. So an assumption is a range of tolerable truth wherein a belief still holds. So this one's a little bit tough to understand, but I'll use an example to kind of help illustrate it. So, for example, let's say you wanted to ride a train to go from place A to place B. So there's going to be an assumption that's made that A, the train is running, that B, the wait times are reasonable, that C, there's going to be space on that train, that D, you can afford the price of it, right? So there's all these assumptions that are baked in that are kind of taken for granted. And so, depending on how much you know about the true reality of it, you can operate within certain assumptions. So if you know, for example, the train runs every 15 minutes, you might not be so set on what time you have to arrive, versus if this is a once a day train, you might have to ask questions like, what time is the train departing? What are the odds that it's oversold? What are the odds that it might be standing room only? What are the odds that the time that I think I need to get to that station is an acceptable amount? So assumptions don't have to end up being the exact answer that you're looking for, but they have to be within a range that is tolerable, such that your journey would be executed well. A goal is an ideal worth pursuing over other ideals. So think of a goal as something that you want to accomplish, something that satisfies your vision of the world, where a vision is the picture of what the world looks like once you accomplish all your goals. And a goal is just a subset of that vision coming to life that you want to pursue within some time frame and against other choices. So it should be relatively easy to pick a goal, but what's a little bit harder is determining which of all possible goals is the one that's worth using as a metric to represent your progress. So generally there's a prioritization to the goals, and it's important to set good goals, but that's a whole nother talk for another day. Just note that for now, it's the ideal that you're pursuing. And a result is a measured change due to actions taken. So you have to be careful that, results are not goals. Results are also not just strictly measurements, but it's a delta in a metric that happened as due to an action that was undertaken. So, a lot of times people like to, take credit for things that are potentially already happening. So maybe your user base is growing, 10% on its own organically, and you take some actions and, that goes up to 15%. Well, you can't claim credit for the entire 15. You can claim credit for only those people that signed up due to the actions that you took. So, and it's really, really hard to measure results precisely, but it's not too hard to measure them roughly. So I think it's just an important of being humble when you do take credit for things that happen, to acknowledge that there's many forces at play, not just the actions that were taken. So the framework here is as follows. So you have your goals. This is what you want to accomplish. This is what will take you towards your vision. And those goals will be impacted by the results that you're able to produce. So you want to be very results driven, and you want to make sure that those results support those goals, that they basically satisfy those goals towards your vision. And those results are going to be a product of the actions that you take. So you take some actions, you get some results, you either achieve your goals or you don't. Now, those actions are built wholly on assumptions, right? And it's the assumptions that make you want to take an action. So they're the justification. The assumptions are the justifications to take those actions. And there's two types of assumptions at play. There's assumptions of truth, basically observation. So you might say something like, customers are struggling to keep track of their customers and vendors and partners today, right? That's an observation. You see somebody actually struggling, right? And then you might have an assumption of relations, basically saying that we believe that if we took the following actions, customers would no longer struggle and would save time, such that we should be able to measure the amount of time customers spend in our system, right? So we should be able to reduce the time spent in our system managing their clients if this assumption is true. So you have to be careful, because some assumptions are a question of what's true, and some assumptions are a question of how actions change the truth. And you will encounter risk in both of these. And risk manifests itself when either your observations or your beliefs about how those actions relate to results are wrong, right? And it's important to acknowledge that no assumption is going to be 100% correct, like ever, except for maybe theoretical things like mathematics or theoretical relationships that have been observed in chemistry or, physics, etc., where you know the answer, but you actually can't get a precise result, right? So it's important to be careful not to confuse theory with reality. So in reality, no assumption is ever going to be perfect. And this is actually a major cause for kind of decision paralysis, where people feel like, oh, I don't have an accurate enough picture. We don't know enough. We can't proceed, right? So that's one side of it. Then on the flip side of it are people that kind of loosely, willy-nilly take assumptions to be truth, like, oh, I spoke to 4 customers and they all said this, therefore it must be true. Let's proceed, right? So you have to be careful to not trivialize the data and kind of just be too loose with it, but you also have to be careful not to be too tight with it. And so there's a delicate balance here, and this is one of the arts of product management, is knowing how much conviction do you need to act. And that's where, and when you act on assumptions, you're inherently introducing risk to your project. Now, that risk can be mitigated by asking questions. And so there's going to be different types of questions, and we'll walk through all the different dimensions here in a second. But generally, you want to question assumptions, and you want to make sure that you question if those relationships are true. You question if the truth is being represented accurately. And I'm a huge believer in doing stuff that's quote unquote free. Of course, it takes labor, it takes time, right? And that's not free to an employer, but it's a lot cheaper for you as a product manager to go through and question things and solicit information and solicit opinions and just really harden these assumptions as much as possible before you start to invest, infrastructure and engineering effort and design effort and surveys. And there's a whole engine that once it's kicked off, just the cost explodes in orders of magnitude compared to, funding a PM and maybe a researcher and an engineer to go on a learning experience where they question and build this model out. There's another set of questions here, which are validations, right? And these are ongoing questions. And these are also important to de-risk because you have to maintain an alignment in the structure ongoingly, right? So everything is constantly morphing and evolving. So so are your goals, and so are the results you're after, and so are how you measure the results, and everything is, in flux. So you want to have ongoing questions around what are our goals? Do these goals still make sense? Or are we pivoting our strategy where we're now pursuing other goals? And you also want to validate the results. Like, hey, did we maybe just get lucky? We spoke to 5 customers and they all wanted this. Maybe we just got lucky and we spoke to the 5 customers that wanted it. And then there's maybe another 500 that don't, right? Did these actions produce the results we were looking for? If our goal was to increase adoption, did it increase adoption? And then also, like, maybe there's a time lag too. Like, so some assumptions, for example, an assumption of relations might say that, hey, if we build this feature, we're going to grow usage by 10%. But then you have to be careful. Like, is it within 6 months or within 2 years, right? Like, what's that time frame that you expect to see the result in? So are we measuring too soon? And are we being impatient and not letting the system play out? Or, are we giving it way too much time and we're just wasting time by waiting around for these results to show up that won't show up, right? So you can see how there's so much subjectiveness in this system, and a lot of people are not comfortable with it. But as a PM, you're just gonna have to be comfortable knowing that there's so much that you don't know, but you still have to be able to operate on this as much as possible. So now let's talk a little bit about the types of questions you might be posing, right? So there's a couple of dimensions. So one that I see that is very commonly overlooked is nobody questions the vision. And many times there isn't even a very explicit vision. There's just kind of maybe a loose, set of knowledge amongst disparate people that have kind of their ideas of what they're pursuing and why. But really, somebody has to bring to the forefront, and it should be the PM, of what is our vision. And a vision can be simply stated as, what do we want to change in the world? And then you should question, why do we want that change in the world, right? Why is that better for humanity if we make that change in the world? And if you, as a PM, if you're probably junior in your career, chances are somebody has already set the vision. So you should at least question it to understand it, because everything gets grounded in what change you're trying to make in the world. There's another dimension, kind of around, I call it physics. Like, this is like, the laws of the universe. Like, is it possible to do what we want to do? This is a tricky one because I think it's easy to kind of fall short and overshoot on this one. Sometimes people want to, do something that's, really innovative and uses the most modern approaches and the best technology. And so, you should be asking, hey, for the project that we have, should we be groundbreaking or should we be kind of tailing the market and just using what's been proven, right? Is it possible to do what we want to do? Is the infrastructure, is the technology, is it out there? And then the next one is, do we know how to do it, right? Do we possess access to the skills, infrastructure, and tools needed to do what we want to do? So if you have some actions that people want to take, you have to be careful, because there's another degree of risk, which is, does your action fall short of what you think it's going to do because it's the wrong action, or because you can't implement the action the right way? So there's 2 degrees to risk in terms of implementing actions, right? It could be the wrong action. It could be that you can't implement it the way it should be implemented. So it's also important to be grounded and realistic about what your organizational capabilities are in pursuing those things. Economics, this one is, again, super important, super hard to get precise, but you should have a sense of swag. So for example, what do we think this thing's going to cost? And then double it, because it's always double, at least. And then how much do we project we're going to make from it over, the lifespan of this project? So software is a little bit tricky because it has a lot of upfront costs, a lot of capital expenditures upfront. So then you have to and then it wanes as it kind of goes into maintenance mode, right? But you have to build at least a crude model of how much you'll be spending year over year and how much you expect to make. And you have to make sure that the economics make sense, right? And you want to bring this to the forefront, because if the economics don't make sense, you can have a very well executed project where everything's done right, but for some reason, the market just never was there and nobody brought that to light. And so then it gets canceled, right? Or sold off at a loss or whatnot. So make sure you're questioning the economics of the model. Make sure you're also keeping in mind the user experience and questioning that. So, will users tolerate the constraints we place upon them? And will they value the value of our product at a greater amount than the constraints placed upon them, right? So keep in mind, you're asking users to sometimes, spend money, spend time, and do things in the way that you want them to do it for them to gain the value they're after. So a simple example might be, hey, if our constraint is that our application is English only, is that tolerable, right? Are customers gonna, put English-speaking users in the system to gain the value? Or are they gonna, reject that premise and say, hey, I won't use it because this constraint is too high? Cost is also a constraint. So the price of your product to a customer will be a constraint. So keep in mind that you have to always be thinking about the user experience as well. And then integrity. And this is my favorite one because it's not a domain per se. It's kind of a layer across all of them. And this is really a question of, are we being honest and upfront with each other as a team, as an organization, as with our customers, or our customers being upfront and honest with us. Many times people tend to kind of assume for the best, let's say. And so then it's like, well, if everything works out great, this will be great, right? Whereas people don't appreciate the realities until they are failing, right? And so that's when, I think it's important to have failed a few times so that you understand how bad trying to salvage a failing project is, such that in the future, you're not going to be, digging yourself into that hole by having all these, great assumptions. Many times people's desires to get a project greenlit, you might say, hey, this is my big break. This project is going to be awesome. The team is super pumped about it. This will be great. And so you have all this like passion and excitement about the vision or about the project that gets in the way of you seeing the truth, right? And I think, it's hard to warn people about it who haven't had a failed project under their belt. I've had like 3 big failures in my career so far. And I think the root cause of it many times is integrity, where people don't want to be upfront and honest about the assumptions. We don't list the assumptions. We don't challenge the assumptions. And we don't want to go look for the truth. Instead, we go look for self-validation, which is extremely dangerous. And that's, a recipe for failed projects. So my pragmatic advice to you guys is document agreements and the assumptions. It doesn't need to be fancy. An email is fine. A document in a shared drive is fine. Meeting notes, whatever you want to use. Just the act of documenting and writing these things down, I found has a sense of, it's becoming real when you do it. When you write it down, it becomes real. It's like it transitions from this domain of, we're just talking about it and it's fluid and flexible and we can just, willy-nilly change our minds, to it's going to require a degree of rigor to undo. So if you write an email and say, hey, today we made the following decision, it's built on the following assumptions, what you're doing is you're leaving the door open for, if those assumptions prove to be wrong, for somebody to come back and say, hey guys, the relationship between these assumptions and this decision no longer holds. We've got, this proof that needs to be incorporated. Or if you need to alter the decision, you get to kind of go back and look at the assumptions and say, hey, what led to this decision? Okay, so, let's say a new team member comes on board, it's easier to, pick up and just kind of see. So it's just, in general, it's easier to see and correct when you've written it down versus it just kind of being lore. The other one is, don't corner people into agreements, right? Agreement doesn't necessarily mean we all think the same. There's no reason to force us all to think the same, right? That's not the goal here. The goal is to say something along the lines of like, we believe that because of these assumptions, the following actions would have the, following result, and that result is going to help us reach our goals. And somebody might say, hey, I don't think this assumption is right. And it might be, however you guys make decisions, maybe it's one person that's kind of the leader that makes the decision. Maybe it's a vote, maybe it's consensus. But the point is that it's okay to have people who disagree, but understand why the decision was made. And then if those people prove to be right, then as soon as that becomes apparent, you can adjust course, right? And so it's important to have them feel like they are not invested in the decision, not in the sense that they won't contribute their best towards the decision coming to fruition, but in the sense that they feel entitled to challenge that decision later if they now find evidence that they didn't have at the, originally when they voiced opinion against it. So it's okay to disagree. And it's okay if it turns out that you're wrong and somebody else was right. It's okay that, 5 of you were wrong and 1 person was right. Like, the point is not to always be right, because then you'll never get to conclusion. And the point is also not to force people into a way of thinking. The point is to act on the best information you have today but to leave the door open for new information to alter course. This is a big one. My advice to you is to assemble that framework as quickly as you can. And when I say that framework, I'm talking about that diagram where you list out the goal, the actions you want to take, and the assumptions that are feeding that. And what you're going to realize is that one, it's going to snap you into action mode, right? And it's going to force you to start thinking about, well, hey, what assumptions do I need to make to justify these actions? And as soon as you start formulating a picture, you can now take that picture and shop it around the organization, shop it with your partners, shop it with your customers. And that picture can be challenged by, many people. And they might say, oh, you know what? I think there's an even better action that will get you there. Or, you know what? Your goal is going to be really hard to measure. I'd modify it this way. Or, hey, I think your assumptions are wrong. I think you should assume the following just to be extra safe, right? So you're going to start getting feedback. And the nice thing about having a picture on the table that the feedback, kind of works into is that it's not an argument between you or I. It's a discussion about how we make this picture more comprehensive and more accurate as a team. So it's a lot easier to strengthen an existing proposal than it is to kind of not have a proposal. And you'll notice you'll probably be sitting in a meeting and it just kind of feels like people are like maybe debating, maybe arguing, maybe discussing, but it's not clear as to how that discussion maps to realizing our vision, right? And what that should be an indicator to you that nobody has actually assembled this framework, or maybe they have, but you haven't come across it. And as a PM, you should be the owner of it. So that's a really bad sign if you're in that case. But it's an indicator that people are not, tactically challenging assumptions or proposing actions or proposing modifications to things. Instead, they're just kind of, I think of it as like floating through space arguing, right? It's not grounded. And so I think using this framework to ground things is going to yield a ton of productivity. And that's why I do it. So going to grounding objections into the framework. So, then another part there is somebody might say something like, oh, I think your assumption is false, right? And you might say, hey, well, is it so bad that we should stop till we figure out the answer? Or can we account for the fact that we might have an assumption in here that we think it's true, but it's not built on strong evidence? So in the meantime, let's go collect the evidence. And you'll notice that most people don't want to block progress. Blocking progress is like asking a spotlight to be shined on you. So there's a lot of people that love to criticize, but nobody wants the spotlight. And so, you have to be careful there because it's like sometimes they might genuinely be giving you the truth, but they don't want the spotlight. So they might let you kind of proceed. But you should be conscientious of the fact that, hey, I'm carrying this risk. This person brought up a risk and I'm now carrying it, and it's my job to validate it. And, if it turns out we do more work in building the model and then this thing blows up, then it's going to be my job to bring it to light. And that's okay. That's your job as a PM. Like, nobody's going to fault you for realizing that the plan is bad. Like, that's literally your job. You get all the credit, not all the credit, but you get the credit that PM deserves when the thing succeeds. And so it's your job to make sure that you get that credit then. But nobody really nobody will, scold you or, criticize you for calling out problems during a kind of design or planning phase, because that's the point, right? And so don't be afraid of that. And if you work in a culture where people, don't let you change your mind with pending new evidence, then, that's a bad culture. You shouldn't work there, in my opinion. Cool. And then, minimize wasted effort by formulating validation questions and expected results. This is super important because you don't want to wait till the results are in to ask the question of, well, are they good or not, right? You should have an idea of like, hey, we think the results as of these actions should be the following. And if it turns out they're not, then, it's bad. And if it turns out they are or are better, then that's good, right? Like, you shouldn't wait to have the discussion about what results we expect to see till the results are in. So have that up front. And then also, you shouldn't have to wait till the project is complete and launched and a year later to start analyzing results. You should be looking for results that are indicators. So for example, you might start by having just a mock of an application you're building, and you should be able to run that by customers, and you should get results. The results, you might say something like are, people should understand what's going on, they should understand why it's valuable, and they should, feel like the application satisfies their use cases, and they should feel that the constraints we're putting on them are realistic, right? And so then when you go through that exercise, if you are, maintain that integrity of seeking the truth and get those results, then that's a great indicator. That's super positive feedback. Put it all in the open, right? Like this is a big one. Like as a PM, nobody should be doing this, but especially as a PM, you don't have secrecy, right? Like, you have to be transparent and upfront. Now, obviously, every culture is going to be a little bit different, so you can't take my advice and adopt it here fully. But I'm a big fan of going to our customers and talking about our plans, right? And just putting it all out on the table with the right expectations that all I'm doing is sharing our vision and sharing our, the actions we're intending on taking. And I want to see what they think, right? And I'd rather get shot down then than later. And again, going back to my previous points, it's like you can't be afraid of failing because, success is not finishing the project. Success is having the impact that you were after, right? Success is meeting your vision. And so if you're going to fail, there's no point in failing later, right? So it's like the sooner you get the criticism, the sooner you ask questions, the better. And the way you get the criticism is by formulating great questions, right? If you just say, hey, what do you think? You're probably going to get answers that are like, I think this is good. Yeah, this is great. I think it's really good. And it's like, that doesn't help. You have to formulate questions like, hey, what could make this better? Or, hey, how long would you, need to implement this in production? What do you see preventing you from using this in production? What would you expect this product costs, right? You have to be hitting the customers or whoever you're validating these ideas with, the executives, the investors. You have to hit them with the hard questions that force them to give you the hard answers. And sometimes you might have to kind of provoke or maybe irritate, maybe annoy, maybe kind of, prod at people to kind of elicit the reaction you're looking for. And so you need to make sure that reaction is not a polite answer, but that it's like a answer that comes from the gut. Like it's a true answer. It's how they really feel. Like, tell me how you really feel. Don't BS me here. Like, I don't have time to spend a bunch of my life on this project only to have it fail. Like, I need to know what will make you want to use this for real. And having that honest conversation means that you have to be vulnerable. You have to make yourself vulnerable, and you have to be willing to just get shredded. And that's extremely important. So, and then the counterpoint to that, just to keep in mind, is you are going to get a lot of negative feedback. That's part of life. And so you have to be careful, because I see people, the first sign of negative feedback, they kind of throw their arms up and say, I knew this wasn't going to work. This is too big or too bold, or I knew we couldn't do this. And so you have to be careful not to be a defeatist, but also not arrogant, right? And so you have to, the model I like to employ here is like, you have to be passionate about the vision. You have to say, man, I really, really, really want that vision to come true. I want the world to be as follows. And I'm going to be perseverant in making that happen. But at the same time, you have to be careful not to put on blinders, not to become arrogant, and to believe that, just because you want it to be true, it will be true. You have to apply a degree of realism in criticizing it, and a high degree of idealism in imagining it. And those two are going to be at odds with each other. And so you have to kind of create a little bit of a split brain existence where you're comfortable carrying the fact that your vision is idealistic, and it's something you want to make happen, but at the same time being able to be realistic and criticize yourself, and knowing when to give up is one of the hardest things, and that's a whole nother talk, and I don't even know that I have a great answer for it, but just knowing when you're being too squishy and giving up too easy, and knowing when you're being too hard-headed and not willing to accept defeat is super hard. But at least I want to bring your attention to the fact that those two forces will be at odds with each other. They will exist in you all the way through the project, even past launch, even through adoption. And then finally, you might get to breathe a moment of relief, when you finally hit your goals, or you're trending towards them so strongly that it looks like you will hit your goals. So yeah, keep that in mind. And then recognize that being ignorant, or kind of closing your eyes and not wanting the truth, all it does is keep bad ideas alive longer than they need to be, and you're not doing anyone any good by doing that. Last one is always ask questions and seek to learn. When those decisions do come up, the more you know, the more context you have, the more you've kind of pulled out of people, the better. So don't squander opportunities to ask great questions. You might be, with a customer, and you might have finished, your talk 10 minutes early, and there's, just 10 minutes left. And so now, hey, that's an opportunity to ask questions about the world. You might be grabbing coffee with, an engineer on your team. That's a time to ask questions. Always be asking questions, always learn. Don't always, you don't always have a reason for that knowledge today, but you'll be surprised, over a multi-decade career, how many times learnings that, weren't sought for a purpose, but were just sought out of curiosity, come back to impact decisions and proposals and things like that in the future. So my advice to you is always be asking questions, and don't worry about sounding dumb. It doesn't matter. And it's usually, kind of per historic stories, it's the clown that ends up being the hero. So don't worry about being a clown. Ask questions, and don't be afraid that, you're supposed to know this, right? Like that's one of my, I hate that, like this idea that it's like, oh, well, you're supposed to know this. It's like, no, I want to know what you think. There's no one right answer. I ask questions because I want to hear other people's opinions. Even if I already hold an opinion that's well-founded, I still want to hear more people's opinions. So it's just a total fallacy to kind of be expected to know something, right? Don't let that hold you back. Ask questions and learn. So with that, thank you all so much. It's been my pleasure. And if you want to connect with me, hit me up on LinkedIn, and we'll take it from there. Thanks again.